In just a moment, Scotland's First Minister. But first, back to Allegra.
OK, this week, a tale of two referendums. The fallout from the Brexit referendum and then the possibility of a second Scotland independence referendum. Neverendum-itis all over again. The interplay between the two in Scotland is very fascinating. Have a look at this. This is from the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, very reputable, and it shows that it has increased since the last independence referendum. This is general mood because, of course, in 2014, independence polled higher than that. It is now at 46%. Now, also, look at this. This is also a rise in Scotland of Eure skepticism, up to 67%, according to the same survey. Now, all of you out there know that 38% of Scottish people voted to leave the EU. Some of these people backed independence, but they may be less keen to back independence again if Nicola Sturgeon is now playing the Remain card. Robert.
So I'm delighted to be joined by the second most powerful politician in Britain, Nicola Sturgeon. Great to have you with us. Can I just ask, is there anything at this stage that the Prime Minister could say to you or offer to you that would persuade you to call off the vote in the Scottish Parliament in just a couple of days' time?
Well, no, the vote in the Scottish Parliament is going to go ahead. You know, I've tried very hard to compromise with the Prime Minister over the past few months. I mean, a lot of viewers, particularly those outside Scotland, probably aren't aware of the fact that we put forward compromise proposals that accepted Scotland would stay in the UK, that we would come out of the European Union, but tried to build common ground around single market membership. We proposed new powers for the Scottish Parliament, short of independence, to try to protect Scotland's interests. And all of those compromise proposals were rebuffed. We met with a brick wall of intransigence. So, in a sense, we got to where we got to this week because the UK government had simply refused to move an inch towards compromise. Now, if Theresa May wants to change and seek compromise, I've said, of course, I'm willing to talk, but I have to say the experience of the last few months has not been very encouraging in that respect.
In terms of compromise, the significant thing she said, actually in an interview with me a couple of days ago, was now is not the time. She wasn't ruling out a referendum forever. Would you be prepared to compromise on the timing of a referendum?
Well, again, I set this out quite clearly yesterday. I mean, if I can start with trying to find the area of consensus between us. She says, now is not the time for a referendum. I agree with that. I'm not proposing a referendum now. I've set out the window, the time frame in which I think it would be fair and reasonable once the terms of Brexit are clear, but before it's too late for Scotland to choose a different path. Now, she said she doesn't agree with that timescale, so I think it's for her then to say what timescale she thinks would be appropriate. And then, yes, I'm happy to have that discussion within reason. I think it is important, though, that, you know, Scotland should have a choice, and this is all about choice. Change is coming. This is about having a choice over the type of change, and I think we should have that choice before, you know, Scotland is taken out of the EU and you know, a long period of time elapses, making it much harder for Scotland to try to negotiate a different relationship with Europe. But you know, I'm up for discussion with Theresa May. I always have been. The difficulty in progressing that discussion has been an intransigence on the part of her government.
Now, I mean, for what it's worth, my sense is that they would be prepared to discuss a referendum in, let's say, 2021. Would that be reasonable to you? But
that's, you know, no, I don't think that is reasonable, because by that point Scotland has been taken out of the EU. 2 years have elapsed. Presumably there is, you know, divergence opening up between the rules of the European Union, the single market, and where the UK is going. And I think it then gets much harder for Scotland to seek a different course. But if she's talking, you know, in the spring of 2019, a bit later perhaps than I was suggesting, then there may be some room for discussion around that. But it seems to me to be just fundamentally unfair for a UK government having, you know, with Brexit sunk the ship, tried to puncture Scotland's lifeboat as well. So I'm up for a discussion within reason. But this is not a timetable that should be determined by what's convenient for Theresa May, any more than it should be determined by what's convenient for me. But it should be determined by what's right for the Scottish people. And I think when the terms of Brexit are clear, but before it is too late for us to choose a different path, is what would be best for the Scottish people. But
you know very well, First Minister, that actually we may not know the precise terms, particularly of the future trade deal, by 2019. Most serious commentators those involved actually in European politics for ages, thinks that what we'll actually get is a transition deal as the nitty-gritty of that future trading relationship is negotiated. So the Scottish people may not know the nature of our relationship with the European Union on your timescale in any material sense.
Well, again, I tried to set out some of the answer to that question earlier in the week. And I should say, first of all, I mean, what you're telling me there is one thing. I certainly hear that. But I've based the timescale I've set out actually by taking Theresa May at her word. I mean, if you think back to the Lancaster House speech she gave, she said in terms that the future relationship between the UK and the EU, she wanted that to be determined before the UK leaves in the spring of 2019. David Davis and indeed Michel Barnier have said that that then means there has to be a deal agreed 6 months before that to allow for EU ratification. That's what takes me to the autumn of next year as the earliest point at which a referendum would happen. So I'm only going on the basis of what Theresa May herself has said. But what I also said is if that timetable changes, if the 2-year Article 50 process was, for example, to be extended or some other change that we can't foresee right now, then of course that window that I've set may change as well. Because I think what's most important in all of this is that Scotland gets an informed choice. I don't want a Scottish referendum to be like the Brexit referendum with no detail, where 9 months after that referendum, the most detail we've still got is Brexit means Brexit. I want people in Scotland to have an informed choice about the direction we take as a country. And that means clarity about Brexit as well as clarity about independence.
Well, so let's have some clarity about independence. You want an independent Scotland to be a full member of the European Union, is that correct?
That is long-standing SNP policy. That's what I argued for in the past referendum. It's what I argued for during the Remain campaign. So yes, that's what I want.
So membership of the single market not enough. So member of the
I think
European
that's the minimum that we have to get for Scotland. Well,
that's the minimum. It might be a compromise that's acceptable.
I'm trying to answer your.
Sorry.
I'm trying to answer your question. If you could just let me answer. That's the compromise position I set out, that we across the UK try to secure single market membership. And the reason I was prepared to compromise there is because I think that is the minimum for Scotland, is to be in the single market. It's what I think makes sense for the UK as well if it's out of the EU. But my preference is for an independent Scotland to be in the EU. I accept that because we're in different circumstances now, the UK is leaving, then we have to set out, before people in Scotland make a choice, the route, the process and the transition that we would have to make towards that. And, some of that will be determined, of course, by the timing of a referendum and by the timing of the Brexit talks. So I'm being very clear here. I want people in Scotland to have an informed choice. The earliest date a referendum is going to happen in Scotland is 18 months from now. And before people are asked to make a choice on that issue, as in a whole host of other issues, I want people to have the clarity they need to compare with the Brexit deal and make an informed choice about the future of our country. We know change is coming because of the Brexit vote. The question is, what kind of change do we want?
But First Minister, with all respect, it is inconceivable that by even the spring of 2019, you will be able to give a guarantee to the Scottish people that you will be able to enter the European Union. The European Union will simply not have talks with you that would allow you to give that guarantee. So Scottish people won't have the information they need.
Well, again, you're making a number of assumptions there, but what I will do before asking people in Scotland to make a choice is set out, frankly, the position as it will be at that point. Now, that will be very clearly what the process is for Scotland securing our place in Europe. Now, of course, there is a number of discussions that require to take place before we get to that point. But I am very clear about the clarity people in Scotland deserve. And again, I will say, you keep telling me my timescale cannot possibly be credible. I am not in charge of the Brexit timetable. All I can do is set out a series of judgments based on the timetable that Theresa May herself says she is working to. If that timetable changes, I accept that will have an implication on the timetable that I may be dealing with, but I can only work on the basis of what I know right now.
And what do you say to nationalists like Jim Sillars, who argue that for them it's worse to be in the EU than actually in the UK?
Well, great respect for Jim Sellers and for those who support independence but who are not particularly enthusiastic about the EU. We have an honest disagreement around that. What I'd say a number of things. Firstly, and this comes back, I suppose, to one of the core arguments for independence. It's about choice and who decides. Whether we're in or out of the EU should not be decided for us by a vote across the whole of the UK when we've decided to stay in. It's something that people in Scotland should have the ability to decide our own future. I also think an independent Scotland in the EU will stand up for Scotland's interests much more strongly than has often been the case with the UK on Scotland's behalf. But these are debates that we will have. The independence question, obviously triggered again because of Europe, is much, much bigger than just the issue of Europe. It is fundamentally about who decides the future of the country.
Now, your own economics advisor, Andrew Wilson, says it's going to take up to a decade to get the Scottish deficit down to an acceptable level. That's not a great sort of argument to put to the Scottish people for independence, is it?
Well, firstly, Andrew hasn't concluded his work, and the reports earlier in the week about the conclusions his work was reaching were false, as he himself has said. But he is doing a very detailed piece of work, because this is one of the core issues that I accept that we require to put a clear plan in front of the Scottish people. Now, take the question of the deficit. Scotland's deficit exists whether we're independent or not. It's a deficit that's not a result of Scotland being independent. It's been created on the watch of Westminster. The question for us is, how do we deal with that deficit? How do we best work our way towards a stronger and more sustainable future? If we stay within the UK, we know we're facing years more of austerity. We know we're facing further cuts to our budget. We know we're facing the economic impact of Brexit and coming out of the single market. My argument is, let's take control of the decisions we need to take to work our way out of deficit and towards a stronger future. And that's exactly what Andrew Wilson is looking at. The Growth Commission that he chairs will conclude its work in the next few months, and we'll put that out for public scrutiny and debate.
But, I mean, you know, we're talking about economic reality. The simple reality is England,
Absolutely.
Wales, Northern Ireland, a much bigger market for Scottish businesses than the rest of the EU.
And I'm not suggesting that we stay in the single market instead of trading across the UK. Trade across the UK is important for Scotland. It's important for England as well in terms of the trade it does with Scotland. And, you know, we've got a Prime Minister right now, rightly, and this is an area I absolutely agree with her on, saying to the Republic of Ireland that the UK being out of the EU and Ireland being in the EU does not mean a hard border and does not mean barriers to trade. And I would simply say to the Prime Minister, it's not credible to say that to Ireland and yet say the polar opposite to Scotland should it become independent. We've also got a UK government right now that is saying it's going to trade freely with every country in the world. It strikes me as a bit incredible that that would somehow exclude an independent Scotland.
First Minister, a pleasure as always talking to you. My thanks to you. But don't go away, because after the break, we've got that king of the one-liner, Milton Jones.